Hello, we are now going to talk about cells. Isn't it really neat that all of us started out as one cell? That kind we call a zygote, right? And there you are today. A few trillion cells, all started with that one. And it divided and divided and divided, and there you sit. Those kind of cells like this one that are going to give rise to any kind of cell, those are called stem cells, if you haven't bumped into that idea. We'll talk about that later, probably a long time from now, but it's one of the neatest things that you could think of. All of us started out as one little microscopic cell. So here we go. So just like molecules are made of smaller parts, atoms, and everything's made of molecules and atoms, so also if we look at an organism, a living thing, we can chop it up into small parts that we call cells. Now those cells are made of molecules. We can chop them up further, but they wouldn't be alive anymore. So a cell is the smallest unit of living stuff. And you and I are multicellular, like all animals and plants, all multicellular. Some organisms are only made of one cell. They're called unicellular, right? And all these cells and all these organisms, what that means is you and each and every cell you're made of must accomplish the same functions to maintain that thing we call life. What must you do and each one of your cells? You got to take up nutrients. You got to change them around, process them. You have to get rid of some of the parts of those nutrients that you chopped up that are called wastes. You have to respond to environmental stimuli, like when you sweat, when it's hot. It's just as a common example. And while every cell and every person and every cat and dog doesn't necessarily reproduce, as a kind of thing, the ability to reproduce is a function of life and therefore is in that list of basically what is life. This is a list that's like, what are the characteristics of life? And one of them is reproduction, or the ability to reproduce, I should say better. So, one of the things that is in the EOC syllabus, and we'll see it probably next slide, is called cell theory. And one of the ideas, just general idea about science, is that science and technology goes hand in hand. So humans conceptualized the fact that big living things were made of smaller units, but until they could see them, until we could see them, until the microscope was invented, that was like right about the time that Columbus sailed to America. The first what we would probably define as a microscope was produced. Um, Zach Jansen, I think was his name. Um, so that technology led to discoveries, and then more technology led to knowing about cells, which led us to these ideas called the cell theory. Now, in 2020 here, we had to skip some scientific method stuff. What's a theory? Well, a theory is an explanation. In science, a theory is not like your opinion or your guess, right? It's an explanation based on lots and lots and lots of evidence. So these ideas about cells, these things called cells that we call the cell theory, comes from lots and lots of observation, which started here. This is the guy that actually chose the name cells. He also, as you can see, was the first to see an astronomical thing through a telescope, Jupiter's great red spot. So, what's the cell theory? Oops, sorry, that's the next slide. I threw the microscope stuff in here because remember when you see red here, that means this is the OC syllabus stuff. So they're going to likely ask you one question, probably on the 65 question EOC test, about types of microscopes, their structure, their function, compare and contrast, how are they alike, how are they different. They're mostly going to ask you differences. How they're alike is that they make small things visible. So what can microscopes that use light to see objects do that microscopes that use electrons to see objects not do? One is to see color. Color is all about light. So when you're looking at something under the microscope, if it's colored, that means you're looking at a light microscope, like the kind we'll use in class, because we can't afford electron microscopes. That's another difference. They're a lot more expensive. You can see cells that are alive, or even little organisms that are alive. The process it takes to produce a thing that can be viewed by an electron microscope necessitates that that thing is sacrificed, that it's dead, because there's some preparation of that thing that has to be done that causes it to die. So they're cheaper, like I said, but the much lower magnification compared to an electron microscope is the big advantage of an electron microscope. So you also have a couple kinds of electron microscopes, and actually you have a couple kinds of light microscopes, but for the EOC test, when they use this word scanning, they're only going to be talking about an electron microscope. What a scanning electron microscope or light microscope does is it allows you to see the surface of objects in 3 dimensions. Whereas the kind of microscopes that we'll use in class and the kind of electron microscopes called a transmission electron microscope sees the inside of cells because it sends those electrons or that light through. That's what the word transmission means. It sends it through it on its way to making an image for your eye. So here's a neat. Now a laser is a light thing. So these are pictures from a light, specifically laser scanning microscope, not an electron one. These are insect parts. Little creatures, you can identify that as a fly, probably that one right there. But these are really neat, and they're colorized. Okay, now this is a laser kind of microscope, so it's light, so you could see some colors maybe, but these images are colorized. You can take an electron micrograph. This picture would be called a micrograph. You can take an electron micrograph and color it all you want, but remember, if it was taken with an electron microscope, that picture is going to be black and white until you colorize it. Really neat detail that you can see when you scan the surface, and you can see it in 3 dimensions. Okay, so this is an idea. Now we're getting back to the cell theory. This is an idea that represents very intelligent humans trying to take a stab at explaining the universe without much knowledge to work with. And it doesn't mean, again, they were unintelligent. It just means they didn't have a book like you have to look up and see what other people have discovered so that you can build on that. So if you have been reading this top one right here, this is like a recipe for mice published in a little pamphlet by this guy who is quite the physician and chemist. He discovered quite a few things, but this is how he thought you could make mice. A dirty shirt, throw some wheat in there, let it sit for a few days, and boom, the wheat gets transformed into mice. Now, we know now that that's not how little baby mice are made, right? And so in the same way, it was thought that little larvae of flies that we call maggots could just appear spontaneously. They could be generated spontaneously from stuff that wasn't alive. However, it didn't take too long for us to come to understand that the way that mice are made is from other mice. And so if now we move that idea to the cellular level, we come up with one part of the cell theory, one big part of the cell theory. So here's our red stuff before. There's 3 parts of the cell theory, and they aren't quite in this little clarification. It says students will describe and or explain the cell theory without listing what it is. That'll be on the next slide. And so what they will also likely ask you in this cell theory format is, do you know what a theory is? Do you know that it's based on lots of scientific information, lots of evidence? And do you know that our human ideas that we call a theory, if we have enough evidence for how something works, we always hold out the possibility that we don't know everything. And so through continuous investigations, we might change our ideas. And that answer on a test of why we would change a theory, why we would modify it a little bit or a lot, is always, we've got better evidence now. We've got new and better, more convincing evidence. Okay, so here's where they tell you that they might tell you a story about these guys, but they're not going to ask you to know who did what. All right, that's their way of telling you that. Okay. So now, here's 1, 2, 3. Here's the parts of the modern cell theory, right? These two guys are given credit for, coming up with this, although it's really the combined work of lots of people. And so this is now 1839, okay? 1665, microscope was invented. We first see these things called cells. Almost 200 years later, scientists come to an agreement that all living things are composed of cells. Some of them are only one cell, but all cells are a fact of life, so to speak. And then, just like mice come from other mice, not from non-living stuff, all cells come from other cells. A Russian guy is often given the credit, so to speak, for that idea. This suggests all living things are related in a way that we'll get to when we get to evolution chapter. And then number 3 here is that cells are the smallest unit of life. You can say this several different ways. These first two things, this is about the only way you can say them. But this is often said several different ways. Cells are the smallest units of function and structure. Cells are the structural units of an organism. And what that means is that everything you do, from moving and digesting your food to thinking thoughts and feeling emotions, even those abstract things, is a result of things that your cells are doing. That's kind of another way to saying what number 3 of the cell theory says. Okay, so here's a little practice. Okay, I'll give you a second to read that, and then maybe stop the video here and read it and come up with an answer, and then I will talk about it. Okay, you're back. All right. Which statement describes a component of the original cell theory that was removed because of, again, better evidence, new scientific knowledge? Well, this one is still part of it. This one is still part of it. Those were the first 2 parts that we looked at. This is the one that says we figured out this is not right. Cells can't come from dead stuff or non-living stuff through spontaneous generation. D here, just to check, right, is the 3rd part of the cell theory that we named, and so C is the answer to this one. And this is a very common multiple choice question for cell theory. They expect you to know those 3 parts, so they ask you which of these A, B, C, D is not part of the cell theory. Okay, so now we're going to start to break down different kinds of cells, like plant and animal cells. And first, cells called prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, right here, right? But we're going to start with the things that all cells have in common, which also number 3, just like kind of like the cell theory did, right? All cells, no matter what kind they are surrounded by a membrane that is called the plasma membrane. We're going to see that membrane is inside of cells, a whole bunch of membrane is. And this word plasma is reserved as an adjective for that outer cell membrane, not any of the inner ones. Okay, just like it says there. All right. All cells contain genetic material in that little body that we call a chromosome. And those chromosomes are made up of what units that we call genes. We'll talk about this in a whole unit in the second quarter. and they are made of that nucleic acid chemical called DNA. This is something we've learned is true of all cells. And then the other thing that all cells have are those tiniest of little cell parts that we call organelles. These are the tiniest ones, and their function is to make proteins. We'll talk about them in several slides from now, but all cells have them. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other cell parts. This is a cell part that all cells have. This is a cell part that all cells have. This, you can call this a cell part if you want to, made of this molecule. All cells have those three. Okay, so now we look at compare and contrast the structures found in prokaryotic cells and in eukaryotic cells, and they don't give us a list whatsoever to help guide us. So I'll fill in what I think they might ask you on this test, this EOC test. But this is again in red. This is one of the EOC things, right? So the kind of cells that are called prokaryotic. First of all, karyos is a Greek word that roughly translated means nucleus. So somebody thought this would be a good name for those cells that don't have a nucleus. They were around before the nucleus, which is literally what prokaryote means. And this prefix U means true. These are the words somebody chose to describe these cells compared to those cells. The ones that have a nucleus, like yours and mine, compared to the ones that don't, which are those kind of little microorganisms. All of them are just one cell, their whole little body, and we commonly call them bacteria, and now we're going to learn that there's kind of like two kinds of prokaryotes and archaeas, a word that you don't use as much, but all of you have heard of bacteria. Okay, so all other forms of life, what's that mean? Plants, animals, fungi, and that big group we call protista. This is a little confusing just vocab-wise because prokaryote and protista both start with PRO, but that big group we call protista are made of cells with nuclei, eukaryotic cells. Okay, so if we were in class, we would play this video and use it because it's a good one that covers everything, but I'm skipping it here and I'm going to just use the words. You can watch it at home. Okay, so a major difference between the two is the fact that, as their name suggests, in a eukaryotic cell with a true nucleus, those chromosomes that every cell has are surrounded by a membrane, and that's what makes this part a nucleus. But in a prokaryotic cell, they have chromosome, just one really, made of DNA, but it's not surrounded by its own membrane. Membrane bound. It's not membrane bound, and the area though that it's found in that cell is called the nucleoid. This is definitely not an EOC word. I'm throwing it in there, no extra charge, right? So that's one difference specifically. In general, here's a couple other parts that a prokaryotic cell has. Here's a picture of one. Here's a diagram of one, right? This is that chromosome. It's actually circular. It's made of the molecule that we call DNA again. Here's little tiny ribosomes. I told you they're the tiniest of cell organelles. They would look just like a little speck in a micrograph. Then all prokaryotic cells have a cell wall, a part we'll talk about later. All cells have a plasma membrane, right, as well as ribosomes, as well as that genetic chromosome stuff. And then this capsule is something that not all bacteria cells have. We'll forget about it. A flagella is a part we'll talk about later, so I'll just point that out now. Okay, so we got lots of vocab in this class in general, and lots of it in this chapter. And a lot of it you're familiar with because I know you've had cell stuff before, but one of them is cytoplasm. The specific definition of cytoplasm is this. Here's the plasma membrane. If this is a eukaryotic cell, there's also a nucleus. The definition of cytoplasm is everything between the plasma membrane and the nuclear membrane. All this stuff, And that includes things like mitochondria that I know you've heard of, that we'll get to, right? Not just the fluid stuff. Cytoplasm is not all liquid. Cytoplasm is the liquid stuff and other things like mitochondria and things. So if you look at a big word for all the molecular stuff that living cells are made of, protoplasm would be that word. Okay, so membrane-bound organelles, like the nucleus, right? But also like mitochondria and chloroplasts and several other kinds. This is now the general difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, because prokaryotic cells do not have any membrane-bound organelles. It's not just the nucleus, but it's other ones. That one little part that we do call an organelle, but is not membrane-bound, that prokaryotic cells have, like we said, are ribosomes. They are not surrounded by their own membrane. That's what membrane-bound means.